Hi everyone, I'm Lori from Lori's Country Cottage, and today I'm going to give you a good gift giving idea, a casserole cover. So it's good for potlucks as well as a wonderful gift for Christmas. So stay tuned. So here we are with our fabrics that we need. You will need, of each fabric, your inside or your lining and your outside, you will need 1 meter of each. You will need 1.9 meters of the Insul-bright. The Insul-bright is narrower, and so you need to get 2 lengths of what you need to make the casserole cover. Now when I did this one, I did a binding around the edge, and that is up to you. I liked how flat it lays, but I will show you as well how to do it by berthing, as Eleanor Burns says, turning the inside out and then stitching around the outside. A much quicker and easier way. I had this machine quilted on the long arm machine, and it would be easy enough to cut your pieces and just quilt them, as I did with the, what did I make last week? The sewing machine cover, by sewing diagonally following a piece of tape. So what you want to do is cut 30 by 17 inches of each of your materials. So your lining, your Insul-bright, and your top fabric. You're also going to want a 12 by 40 inch piece of the same, one of each. Now if you decide to quilt it, you can quilt it and then bind it. What I did when I did that, the sewing allows for a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I didn't use a seam allowance in this one because I bound it, so I didn't need the seam allowance. So I just subtracted 1 inch off the measurements. So rather than being 17 by 30, it's 29 by 16. Rather than 12 by 40, it's 11 by 39. So I just took into account that I will not lose my seam allowances, and I just bound them. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is put our fabrics right sides together, the back or the lining and the outside fabric, and the Insul-bright on the back side of that. And I put the Insul-bright, it has a reflective coating on one side and a batting on the other. It does not require quilting, so you don't have to quilt this. So I've put that facing, the foil part facing the lining, so that if you can think of this, is my casserole will be lying on here and the heat will be reflected back in. And so what I've done is I pinned all the way around here, and I am going to stitch, leaving an opening of about 5 inches to turn it. So I'm getting ready to sew, and I want to have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I have shown before this product. It is called Sewing Edge. It comes from Quilt with Marcy Baker, and I think it's a very valuable tool in your sewing room. I like to put it on my sewing machine. Now it comes in a longer strip, and the Ukrainian in me cuts it into smaller pieces. So all I need is a small piece, because I don't need it to come all the way to the front. As long as I have enough on my sewing bed to lean on when I am sewing. So I have a little seam guide, and the seam guide has markings on it that are 1/4, 3/8, 1/2, 5/8, and 3/4, and there's little holes in here. I don't know if you'll be able to see that. There's little holes in here with those markings on. What that is for is you put that by your presser foot, under your presser foot, and you slowly lower your needle into the seam allowance. I got it in here backwards. The seam allowance that you want. So I need a 5/8 seam allowance. So I slowly put the needle down into the hole. I can't see with this foot. There I go. Now if I put this down, my presser foot down, and then I line this up even with the edge, and that's going to give me a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And so now all I have to do is make sure my fabric is aligning on here when I'm sewing. As you can see, I started it past the arm that comes out of my machine so that if I need to change my bobbin, I can get in there to do that. Okay, so I take my needle back out and I'm ready to sew. So I'm all ready to sew here. I'm going to line the fabric up along this sewing edge, and I'm going to sew all the way around, pivoting at the corners until I get back here, and I've marked it with a little X so I know to stop to leave myself an opening to turn. So you can see now that I've clipped the corners off here so that it's close to the edge. I've left the rest of the seam allowance there. Now I've left an opening here for myself to turn. What I'm going to do is fold this back on the seam allowance, and I'm going to press it. What that will do is make a nice, easy mark for when I need to sew it together on the other side. Okay, so now I've got both of those folded back and pressed. And I'm going to want to turn this. And I need to point my corners out. So you want to use a point turner of some sort. And you want to repeat that with all 4 corners. So I'm just poking the last corner out here. And what I'm going to want to do is press this so it gives me a very nice edge, crisp edge to do my top stitching on. So I'm going to press it flat first. All the way around, I'm pressing it. So it makes a nice crisp edge for me to do my top stitching on. Okay, so now I'm going to press this nice and flat. So I can do my stitching. Now here is where I pressed it previously so that it made a nice easy fold for when it's time to do this part where I want to stitch that shut when I do my top stitching. So I press that all the way around. Now this is going to be the outside of my casserole carrier. So this is the side I'm going to top stitch on. I'm going to pin this shut so it's held for me to do my stitching. Now if you would prefer, you could stitch this by hand shut, but I'm just going to stitch it when I do my top stitching. So I'm going to stitch all the way around as close as I feel comfortable to, which is going to be pretty close to the edge. Now you want to do the same thing with your 12 by 40 inch piece. You want to do the same thing. Create yourself a little piece like that. So I'm just coming around the last corner of my top stitching. I did my top stitching at about 1/8 of an inch. There was a little mark on my sewing machine on my presser foot, so I'm using that as my guide. And when I come to the end, I'm just going to do a little back stitch here to secure it. And there I go. I decided to sew this today at the store rather than at home, and I didn't bring my snips with me. And so I opened up these little clover snips. They are wonderful. The blade is all attached in here, right into the handle. And then it's got the soft handles that are flexible so that they don't bother your hands if you're doing a lot of cutting. Very, very nice clover scissors. Okay, so I've got this all stitched all the way around, and my top stitching has closed up the opening. I don't remember where the opening is. So now here's what I like about doing the binding rather than this, is that when you do it with the binding, it just lies so nice and flat. And so either way works, depends how much time you have. I did do the binding on this by machine, and then I flipped it and I stitched in the ditch here to hold the back. So it didn't take me as long as had I done it by hand. So you want to repeat the same technique here to make your second piece, your 12 by 40. And then I'll show you how to put it together. So I have stitched this together. I overlapped my strap by 3/8 of an inch. I pinned the one side to hold it. Once I started stitching on here, I come along one edge, took the pin off, went to the edge, pivoted, went backwards, and I went over it a few times to hold it well. You want to use a thread that matches because you will see this. So then what I want to do is be sure that my strap is not twisted, and I want to fold it in half so I find the centers. Okay, and I'm going to mark that. You want to try to make sure that the seam that you've put in your strap ends up underneath the casserole dish. You don't want it in the top parts of your strap. So now I want to spread this out again. And I'm going to fold this in half to find my center. And I'll mark that. Now I know that these will all be lined up. So about 4 inches from the edge, I'm going to put the edge of my strap. Okay, so I'm perpendicular, or parallel, pardon me, with the edges, with the long edges. And I'm about 4 inches from the edge is the inside edge of my strap. I want to pin that in place, and then the same thing on this side, 4 inches in, and I'm going to put my strap down, but I do want to make sure that my centers are lined up. And then I want to be parallel with this edge. Okay, I lay that on. Now I want to pin it in place. And then I'm going to take my casserole dish and I'm going to lay it on here. And that's going to dictate, there's my center, dictate where I'm going to stop stitching. I want to just stitch underneath the pan. So that is going to be right here. And right here. Now I think what I'm going to do now is just measure from here. And that's at 10 inches. And so I'll mark this one at 10 inches is where I'm going to stop sewing. Now I'm just going to check to make sure that I am still even here. For this one just moved a titch. Actually, that's 3, I guess. Three to the edge. And not 3 to the edge. Then I'll measure 10 from here. Was where my pan finished. And 10 inches from here is where my pan finished. So I'm going to stitch on both sides, make a rectangle here using the strap. And the same thing on this side. Measure in my 3 inches. Measure my 10 inches, just double check. Whoops. Okay, now I'm going to stitch on all the way into a rectangle there and a rectangle here. So what I did was I folded this in half this way and marked for the center. So I've got the center marked of the inside of the shorter piece. Then I did the same thing here and I marked the center of the outside piece. Now these 2 spots are going to line up and I will pin it in place. Now to keep things straight, what I'm going to do is pin this in place and then I'm going to stitch in my same seam line that I had when I did my binding. Now if you've done the flip method, then you can use your top stitching as your sewing line. So I'm going to want to stitch both of those and then I'm going to flip it over. And again, I'm going to use my stitch lines again to stitch on this side. The only thing left is to add your Velcro. So now what's left is to put the Velcro on. So on the inside, you want to put a slice of your Velcro here. The smaller one, you want to cut a 4 and a 6 inch. So you're going to put the 4 inch on here and you're going to sew it even with the edge. Fold this in and pull this over. Pull it nice and snug on your pan and that will indicate where you should put the next piece of Velcro. So I'll mark it where it sits. And my Velcro will be right here along the edge. So that's a 1/2 inch in. So a 1/2 inch in from here, I will put my other piece of Velcro, center it, and sew it on. I'm going to do the same thing with this side, but a longer piece, a 6 inch, so it fits in here between your straps. So you put one on here, fold this in, pull this snug, mark it, and then you're going to sew your Velcro on here. And you sew your Velcro through all the layers. So now you are ready for a good casserole recipe. Thank you very much for watching.